Hello, hello, and welcome to today's episode of Talking All Things Cardial Pulm. I am your host, Dr. Rachel Burriesci. Before we start today's episode, I'd love to highlight our show sponsor, Jane. Jane app is a clinic management software and EMR designed to help practitioners grow and manage their clinics. They do this with helpful features like online booking, scheduling, billing, and documentation. Whether you're working solo or in a large multidisciplinary clinic, no-shows and late cancellations are something every practitioner faces. Jane offers several tools to help you prevent and manage those no-shows, including the ability to save a credit card on file and send out automated SMS and email reminders. Learn more about Jane's helpful features at jane.app/payments. Listeners can also mention my 1-month grace period code, CardialPulm1MO, at the time of sign up. Thanks again, Jane. All right, welcome. We are at the end of March, right? Like, what is happening with this year? I don't know if anyone else feels this way, but I feel like time is just flying, and I'm like, I can't believe we're moving into April. So that might be a me problem, but I just feel like we're moving at a fast pace. And I don't know if you all are into astrology, but every now and again, I get like, wow, it's like such a weird vibe right now. Like weird things keep happening. If you work at the hospital, there are times where you literally say, is it a full moon? Like that statement happens a lot. And when you have that feeling and you check, it's usually right around that full moon time. So last week was a shit show, like straight up shit show. My Monday started not the way I anticipated. Had a couple of people enter my ecosystem that I had my visceral red flag feeling up, and I was right? So just like, I'm not going to go into the details, but always trust your gut and protect your shit. Like that's all I can tell you. But for real, trust your gut. That innate sense that something isn't right, that feeling that this doesn't feel right is usually spot on. I very much believe in my gut. My gut has always steered me in the right direction. And if I don't feel like something sits well, I can't leave it alone. And I'm glad I didn't. So just a weird week. Things did not go in my favor in certain ways and kind of just threw off my whole week. I was trying to finish up taxes and then I got bombarded with nonsense that kind of took away my focus. And also, when something is kind of lingering and your emotional state isn't in a good place. Anyway, it felt off. And so I was like Googling, that is like Mercury in retrograde. I don't even know what that means, but I know when it happens that wild shit's happening. And so there's some weird stuff happening. I don't follow astrology, but I very much believe in all of that stuff. And I don't know, there's something about there's a lunar eclipse happening, and there's something about the cardinal signs are like very volatile right now, but things will go in their direction if they want it. So just like a lot of things are happening, and I think we have like multiple eclipses happening in a short period of time. Anyway, something was going on last week, and I don't think we're in the clear for about another 3. In the midst of all this, I went out for a walk with Rem right after like an episode happened, and we get around the corner like we normally do, and she puts on the brakes. And when I mean puts on the brakes, I can't use any of my tips, tricks, any of my things that we work through with the trainer. If you have a dog and you do any training with your dog, a lot of it has to do with you. Most of the time when you're doing training, they're really training the human. And with things like putting on the brakes with walking, it's just a lot about leash pressure and, being confident and moving forward. And so, you 2-hand the leash and you just walk, and eventually the dog follows you. But she was not following, and we were sort of almost dragging. And I was like, nope, we're at the point where I don't feel comfortable with it. If someone's passing, they're definitely going to stop me, even though I'm totally being like trying to do the right thing. Um, and then I really thought to myself, it might be me. It might be my vibe, my energy, and whatever. So we went out the next day, and the same thing happened. So I just let it be. I tried to like do some of our games and stuff, and I couldn't get her to go. And I had to just go back inside because I didn't want to get frustrated and then ruin that whole thing. Um, so if you're in my ecosystem and you follow me on Instagram, you know that I post me and Rem walking almost every day. And some people, it's one of my like like what people know about me. Like they know what a two-tail mom means. And someone came up to me at CSM and they're like, two mom tail. And I was like, yes. One of my knowables. That's the word I was looking for. Um, but part of why I post her walking, besides the fact that she's so damn cute and getting steps in is so important, um, is because we had such a hard time. And in September 2020, she just stopped walking on leash, and her sensitivity just kind of came out of nowhere. It's like she turned one, and someone flipped a switch, and her anxiety, her fear, all just like it was rough. And we tried all kinds of things. We had done training like when she was really little, and so we carried a lot of that stuff through, and it just wasn't enough. So we had to find a behaviorist who deals with fear and anxiety, and it was hard. The training was hard. I really liked the guy's method, but he was a little bit of a and a lot of the critiquing is coming at me and how I'm saying the words and like my inflection, all of the things. So part of dealing with fear and anxiety with dogs is actually building confidence. And so Rem was a stray and she was found very young. They said she was 3 months, but I would have to guess that she was younger than that. And they spayed her at that age. So when we got her, she was already spayed and she was only 3 months. And if I had to guess, she was younger than 3 months. I think they should have waited to get spayed. And clearly, she was not with her mother for like important periods of time in that early stage. And her sister, who we knew, also has the same fear, anxiety kind of stuff. So it was work. And part of the training is turning every meal into a training session. And so basically, since January of 2021, every single meal, so 2 meals a day, have been training. In the beginning, they were very intense. They were very labor intensive. I was making obstacle courses with furniture, trying to be creative, inside, outside, upping the game. And we I don't want to say we slacked off, but we kind of have a routine at this point and we do the things in our routine and we haven't been upping the challenge. And I think we had been talking about it. We're like, we probably need to start changing the environment, changing the cues, changing the whole thing. But it's time and effort, right? So when I am working from home, it's not that bad because I'm in the house and I can go outside and do 10 or 15 minutes of training. If I'm leaving for the hospital, it is not that easy. Like getting out the door, trying to get her in the car, drop her off at my mother-in-law's, and then making a shuttle is like, it's like a race every single hospital day. So thinking about like upping that training in the morning feels a little daunting again. But we were talking about starting to up it. So when she put on the brakes, I had that internal panic that we had fully regressed. Now, this whole episode won't be about dog training, but this is part of my life. And it really relates to a lot of different things. So I'll have a parallel after, but having to do that training and having to push her through those like tough points wasn't easy. In the beginning, one of the training things that you do is you have the dog on leash. And this is like a very common training technique. If you ever have a new dog, you have them on leash and you basically always have them on leash with you throughout your entire day so that they're like with you and they're on leash. So when we started this training, we were teaching from home because I was still in academia, and I had her on leash through class. And if you couldn't have the dog on leash when she's not on leash, she had to be in the crate. Sometimes she's like crying because she doesn't understand what's happening. And so there's just like this whole psychological process that's happening. I'm sure my energy played into it, right? Like stress from hearing her, it's like a whole thing. And I just thought, I really hope we don't have to start from base. Now, when we went out, a couple of things happened. We had neighbors down the block that were doing construction. I typically don't listen to podcasts on my walk for a number of reasons, but the only thing I do on my walk that is like, I don't even know what the word is. The only thing I do other than walking with Rem is talking on the phone for my morning stories. Otherwise, we're in sync and I'm paying attention to her. I'm paying attention to my surroundings. We've had so many loose dog situations that I can't like not be paying attention. But I have been listening to more podcasts and this is a great time because I'm not trying to dual task. So I had my podcast on as we left, which was different. And she put on the brakes. Now I didn't know if a sound happened when I took my headphones off. The construction down the way was like pretty aggressive. But that hasn't been setting her off as of like recent. So maybe not. And then the second time, there was a military helicopter right above us. And same thing, like we have helicopters over top of us quite often, like low planes, because we have a small airport nearby. Doesn't really set her off. So I don't know if it was the sound, my energy, the atmosphere, because like we've had like storms missing us. But I had that feeling of, oh crap, we're going to start over. And I stopped the walk and didn't try to force it because I didn't want to have that bad energy or experience. So as it pertains to everything else, and I sent a newsletter out about this, her training has been constant for 3 years. We've had ups, we've had downs, and we've had a ton of plateaus. And people get upset about plateaus, but plateaus can be great, right? Like you're just kind of in harmony, things are going steady, no one's shaking, no one's shaking things up. What we forget though, progress in anything that we do is not linear. And we have to expect ups and downs and plateaus. Highs, lows, and plateaus is part of life. And I think when we have that expectation that there can be a low, that there will be a low, it makes it easier to kind of pass. So last week really took me off my game. I wasn't on social media much. I just really couldn't show up in a great way. And so this is about as much as I'm going to kind of talk about that. But what I will say is that I've had some really fun patients at the hospital, and that also helped turn things around for me. So I've had a lot of patients with pulmonary complications, a lot of heart failure patients. I love my post-op people. And I've had a lot of like repeating things. So the one thing I really wanted to talk about today is paired breathing and just how beneficial it can be in multiple patient populations. So the two populations I want to talk about are the post-op patient and the hypoxemic patient. And paired breathing really can help with both of these populations, but for different reasons. So paired breathing, just to kind of set the stage, is pairing your breath with an activity, specifically a movement. Some people pair paired breathing and pace breathing together, I like to separate them because I think that they're different. Paired breathing typically is the coordination of breath with the breathing mechanics. For instance, if we're talking about breathing mechanics, ventilation, right? The act of breathing. When we inhale, our chest wall moves up and out. When we exhale, our chest wall moves down and in. So if we were to pair a movement with that, shoulder flexion is a great example, right? So if we're going to do, I'm going to scoot my chair back. Sorry for the noise. We're going to do shoulder flexion. I'm going to be breathing on the way up and then exhaling on the way down. Breathing on the way up, exhaling on the way down. Now, when I teach this, I have people try it the other way. So I'm on video. If you're on YouTube, you're going to be seeing this. Watch how much flexion I get. So if I'm inhaling on the way up, exhale on the way down. The reason why I'm going to maximize my shoulder flexion is because I am pairing my rib cage movement with my shoulder girdle movement. They're synergistic in a way. They're compounding. They're helping each other out. If you go the opposite way, if you do the incorrect movement, so I have to think about this. I have to go. It takes me a second to do it wrong. I'm going to inhale at rest and exhale on the way up. I don't go nearly as far. I'm probably within, I'm sorry, I'm going to scoot closer to the mic. I'm probably within functional limits because I have more range than normal, but I don't go nearly as far as my normal. So I want you to try it. If you are exhaling on shoulder flexion, do you feel like you go as far? So this is a great technique to use with post-op patients. And the two post-op type of patients that I use paired breathing with almost always are my cardiothoracic and my abdominal surgery patients. And there's multiple reasons, but think about your incisions, right? So cardiothoracic is obviously like very obvious. We have this incision at mid-sternum. Sometimes we'll have a clamshell incision, so it's under that rib, like right at that rib cage level, under nipple level. Or we might even have a thoracotomy, just one-sided through the ribs. It's going to affect your breathing. It's going to affect your shoulder motion. It's going to affect your thoracic extension, right? Because think about how much stress is put on your thoracic vertebrae if you were to open that chest wall. If you don't address it, patients get rounded shoulders, forward head, a little kyphotic in the thoracic, more than normal, or stiff in the thoracic, right? Because they're afraid to move. And I've had patients say these words so many times too, so I'm going to use the words back. The words are typically, I feel like I'm going to bust my staples open. I feel like I'm going to bust my incision open. I'm going to break my sternum. You're not going to break your sternum with paired breathing. If you do hear clicking or have increased dehiscence with upper extremity movement, that is something to report to the physicians right away. But if we can really utilize breathing and upper extremity motion together in that patient population, a lot of things happen. One, you take the fear out of movement. Two, you maximize range of motion at the upper extremities, thoracic movement, all of the things. And you're going to increase tidal volume with those movements and therefore help with things like atelectasis and mucus production, even though they don't specifically target that. Range of motion is a big piece of it, but really maximizing paired breathing with the movement is also going to really maximize your ability to achieve inspiratory reserve volume or max tidal volume, however you want to call it. So super beneficial. Abdominal surgeries, I talk about this all the time. I feel like I talk about it all the time. So if you listen to me and you're like, I've heard this before, apologies, but once is never. So abdominal surgeries, primary concern post-op is pulmonary complications. Patients post-abdominal surgery end up with things like pneumonia because guess what? It hurts to breathe. It hurts to cough. People automatically think cardiothoracic. They don't always think about the abdomen. If I'm seeing a lot of like liver, kidney transplant patients recently, and they have pretty significant incisions like across the abdomen. Guess what? That hurts when they have to take a deep breath. That hurts when they have to cough. On top of like the anatomical muscle structure, like superficially, they just had organs replaced. And now the diaphragm is literally pressing them. It is a hard sell to get these patients to breathe, but it is so important. So there are a ton of other breathing exercises that I do with them, but paired breathing is always included because what happens when you do, for instance, shoulder flexion is you're going to get a stretching sensation at the anterior abdomen, which is a great, basically range of motion exercise to help prevent adhesions, tightness, all the things. And again, increase confidence of movement. So paired breathing with bilateral upper extremity movement is a go-to move for me post-op. My go-to moves are typically shoulder flexion, horizontal AB adduction, scap protraction retraction, shoulder shrugs. Those are my big ones. Depending on the person, I might get a little more fancy, but those are like my go-to 4. But when I think about paired, and you can do this with lower extremity exercises, you can do this with any exercise that you do. And in theory, what you're trying to do is maximize the movement of the chest wall with the movement of the upper extremities. The other patient population that I love to use paired breathing with are my hypoxemic patients. And I had a ton of patients with like high oxygen needs. And I love this freaking patient because there are so many things that you can teach them to optimize their movement, their breathing, their SpO2 goals, their oxygenation, all of the things, and make them more efficient and take the fear out of movement again. And their fear is different. It's not pain. It's shortness of breath. It's oxygen starvation. It's that feeling that they are not going to be able to catch their breath. With these patients, you want to utilize paired breathing with their mobility. And I don't just mean, I'm not talking about walking, because when we get to walking, we call that paced, in my opinion. I'm talking about bed mobility. I'm talking about transfers. I'm talking about sit to stands. You want to pair your breath with the movement. It helps prevent dyspnea on exertion. It primes the system. It gives them control. It literally puts them in the driver's seat. There are lots of schools of thought on this. There are lots of schools of thought on breathing. So if you don't agree with one of my schools of thought, totally get it. Lots of schools of thought. Doesn't mean either are wrong. Just means it's different. And it depends on what point of view you're coming at the situation from. If we're talking about paired breathing, like I said before, when you inhale, chest wall moves up and out. If we're thinking about the thoracic cate or thoracic vertebrae, thoracic is an extension with inhale. Thoracic is in flexion with exhale. So you can combine thoracic extension and thoracic flexion, thoracic extension, inhale, thoracic flexion, exhale. Same is true for cervical. cervical extension, inhale, cervical flexion, exhale. So, depending on their movement, you can coordinate that breath to maximize the movement and give them the control. And it usually feels right. There are a few patients that just really have a hard time sequencing breath with movement, and they take a little bit longer to kind of make a difference with. And sometimes you just have to match what they're doing and make it work, and it doesn't always follow the rules, if that makes sense. But there was this activity we used to do in cardiopulm lab where we would have all the students do rolling. And so we would have 50 students on the mats, right? And we would coordinate our rolls so we were all moving in the same direction. And we would pay attention to whether they were extenders or flexors during their roll. And the reason why it matters, majority of people are flexors, meaning if I'm going to be in supine position and roll onto my side, typically I'm going to have hip flexion, trunk flexion, and I'm rolling onto my side. That's the majority. Let's say 95% of the class typically are flexors. Then there's this wild 5%, which was always so fun to pull out, that extend on rolling. Based on what your person does is how you coordinate the breath. So it's not just anytime you roll, you're exhaling. It really depends on how your person is rolling, just to like be technical about it. But for the majority of people, what works is in the supine position, you're going to inhale. As they're rolling, reaching for the handrail, sorry for the clunk, you're exhaling. So supine position, inhale. As you roll, exhale. Okay. Then you could do the same thing from side lying to sit. Depending, the thunder has just started if you can't hear it. From side lying to sit, same thing. You can, in side lying, if you're fully straight, inhale on the side, exhale as you come up. Sit to stand, it depends on how much rocking we're doing. And if you've ever taken a Mary Mastery class, highly recommend that you do that. She does a whole series on movement with breath control. And a lot of it has to do with glottal closure. And a lot of it creates stability. So you can use breath control for a number of populations, including the neuro population, to create stability. For the hypoxemic patient, the most important thing is that the movement has a breath, and you don't speed up until you're ready for the next breath. Essentially, you're slowing everything down, and that can be frustrating, and that can be very hard for someone who's short of breath. But typically, when they pair their breath with a movement, they're able to maintain their sats and decrease their overall dyspnea, period. And you can continue to do this with all of the things, right? So for instance, if you had a patient who does slide board transfers, you could have them take a breath with every bump scoot that they do. You could, if you're doing sit to stands for strengthening, you can create a breath for each of the movements. It also depends on their breath control. So in theory, on the stand, you're extending, you're going to be inhaling. On the sit, you're going to exhale, but with control. Because if you don't exhale with control, where you have almost like a force exhale, you're going to lose the stability. So you just really have to watch your patient and their breathing mechanics and then pair it. Like I said, not everyone is textbook. Not everyone follows the rules. Sometimes when you try to pair the breath, it can confuse them and they're thinking too much. As long as the activity has a breath attached to it, it tends to help. If there's also a balance instability, uh, if they have like a glottal issue and they're not really glottal closing and that's creating instability, you can really utilize paired breathing with an intentional hold to try to create said stability. You can use inhale and holding as your stability, not bearing down, but holding. If you are exhaling on the sit because you're in flexion on the way down, you are controlling that exhale. And you can do that either by blowing out in a controlled manner, like where you have this nice eccentric control of your diaphragm, or you can utilize counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. When you're exhaling, when you're talking, you are in eccentric control of that diaphragm. But if you don't control the exhale, you get a plop. So you can truly utilize paired breathing with activity. Some patients will say that they feel lightheaded with added breaths. This happened in pulmonary rehab quite a bit. Typically happened with my COPD population. Sometimes it does happen. It could be the increased oxygenation causing that. It could be creating an increased respiratory rate inadvertently. Did a couple exercises, breathing exercises, with many of my patients this weekend, but there was one person who was over breathing, and I had to have him stop, rest, normal, like start conversation, get him out of thinking to then restart and get back into it. And a lot of times it's trial and error. You don't know if a specific breathing activity is going to work, even though the textbook, the idea, the theory suggests that it should. Sometimes it really depends on the person. I mean, that saying it depends really sucks as a student, but it depends because you're dealing with humans who are dynamic, who respond differently, who don't have one diagnosis. So, really trying and finding what fits and what works can be super helpful. But in the world of hypoxemia, if you coordinate your breath with the movement, you're going to get a lot more out of your patient. And you put the patient in the driver's seat. With shortness of breath, with dyspnea, with high levels of oxygen, with ICU monitors dinging, there's a lot of stress. There's a lot of angst. And with angst comes increased respiratory rate. And so now you have this cyclical problem. Part of my education is telling the patient that they're in control, because sometimes that thought process of controlling the movement, controlling the breath, gives them confidence and also prevents them from getting into that panting type of motion. It does not always work, but it works a lot. And this is one of my go-to moves with most of my patients. But for anyone who has a post-op cardiothoracic and abdominal or are hypoxemic, you will 100% see me teaching my patients how to pair breathe with every activity that they're doing. And again, I always give this disclaimer. And the disclaimer is this takes time. Like, I'm not in and out of the room in 2 seconds. I have to take my time with this because it's a learning curve. Patients have never been taught how to breathe, how to activate their diaphragm, how to coordinate their breathing with a movement. Newer generations are more familiar with yoga classes, mindfulness, meditation. Like, these things are common activities now. The older population really weren't exposed to that. Really concentrating on breathing can be very foreign to them, but also life-changing. But it takes time and you can't rush it, right? Because if you rush it and they're anxious about it and they don't get it, it could either make the situation worse or they're never going to use it again. So you really have to take the time to teach them. And sometimes you have to kind of color outside the lines. If it doesn't follow the rules, but it works for the patient, sometimes you have to do that. So I like to take the theory, the concept, the textbook, apply it, and then adjust it for that patient because we're human, we're all different. And like I said, these patients have a ton of comorbidities. We're not just dealing with one diagnosis, we're not dealing with a textbook. We're dealing with a person with a very complex history, many layers built in, and we have to take that into account as a clinician. So I hope that was helpful for you. That's all I have for you today. I really like to utilize breathing exercises with my patients. Excuse me. This isn't something that I just talk about and don't use in practice. Literally every single patient that I saw this weekend, I did some level of breathing with. And the reason is because it makes a difference. It makes a difference in the moment and potentially long term if they can use it to carry over. And sometimes if you just use it in the moment and it makes a difference, a whole number of things come from that besides building trust with PT, but also feeling better in the moment and also having education on how to combat this problem. Just really gives the patient some um, autonomy in the situation where they might feel not in control. It kind of puts them back in the driver's seat. And I think if we can help them do that, we can really help make changes long term. So if you utilize any of these techniques and you try it and it works, let me know. I love to hear it. If you're curious about how to use these techniques, ask me a question. It always helps me come up with the next topic or potentially video to share. And if it's landing, let me know. So if you enjoyed this episode, feel free to drop 5 stars or write a great review. It is very much appreciated. All right. I hope you all have a wonderful day and whatever you have to do, get after it.